Neverland Eternal Youth Solutions, where abandonment becomes adventure. Because processing grief is hard, but psychologically freezing yourself in childhood, that's branding, baby. Are you emotionally incapable of adulthood? Do taxes make you physically ill? Do commitment, accountability, and emotional maturity feel like ancient curses whispered by demons in a London alleyway? Then you may qualify for the Neverland lifestyle. Introducing the all-new Peter Pan Starter Kit, the only Victorian psychological breakdown disguised as family entertainment. For just 3 easy payments of emotional repression, you'll receive 1 green outfit stitched directly from unresolved childhood trauma, industrial strength fairy dust, a flute soundtrack guaranteed to concern modern therapists, a complimentary shadow that may or may not detach from your body at random, and our patented memory wipe technology. That's right. With Neverland Memory Wipe, you'll forget Mrutsunarum, responsibilities, consequences, former friends, romantic attachment, entire human beings. Why process emotional connection when you can simply erase people from your consciousness like chalk off a school board? But wait, there's more. Order now and we'll throw in the Lost Boys expansion pack absolutely free. Watch in amazement as emotionally abandoned Victorian children follow you into forests, live in hollow trees, develop severe attachment issues, and mysteriously disappear whenever they start showing signs of maturity. That's the Neverland promise. No growing up. No accountability. No therapy. Still not convinced? Listen to these completely real testimonials. I ignored adulthood for 40 years, and now I scream whenever somebody mentions responsibility. Peter L., London. I climbed out the nursery window and now I live inside symbolic literary analysis. Wendy D. I should have gone to counseling. Literally everybody involved in this story. And don't forget our premium Neverland window security system. Why let children maintain healthy family relationships when you can emotionally manipulate them into believing nobody loves them? Neverland, where abandonment becomes adventure. Warning, side effects may include emotional stagnation, identity collapse, existential loneliness, Victorian repression, drowning symbolism, chronic nostalgia, sudden fear of adulthood, becoming a 40-year-old man emotionally trapped in 1904. Do not use Neverland if you are allergic to human development, closure, reality, psychological boundaries, the passage of time. Neverland Eternal Youth Solutions is not responsible for dead pirates, missing memories, existential despair, train stations, water-related symbolism, or emotionally devastating literary subtext. Neverland, because growing up is hard. Disclaimer. The following documentary contains discussions of death, suicide, grief, psychological trauma, emotional neglect, war, depression, drowning, and literary interpretations surrounding the origins of Peter Pan and the life of author J.M. Barrie. This production is intended for documentary, educational, historical, literary analysis, and commentary purposes only. The material presented throughout this documentary is based on publicly available biographies, historical records, published letters, literary scholarship, documented events involving the Llewellyn Davies family, and interpretations of Barrie's original Peter Pan texts, including content that was altered, softened, or removed in later adaptations. Some sections of this documentary contain analysis and interpretation regarding the psychological themes present in Barrie's writing and personal life. These interpretations are presented as commentary and analysis, not definitive medical or criminal conclusions. This documentary does not claim supernatural events, curses, or paranormal activity as factual reality. References to curses, hauntings, or symbolic parallels are used within the context of cultural discussion, literary analysis, public fascination, and the tragic patterns surrounding the individuals connected to Peter Pan. Viewer discretion is strongly advised, especially for viewers sensitive to discussions of suicide and self-harm, childhood trauma and emotional neglect, death involving young people, psychological deterioration, themes of obsession, dependency, and isolation, dark reinterpretations of classic children's literature. I acknowledge that Peter Pan remains an important cultural work beloved by millions of people across generations. This production is not intended to attack individuals who enjoy the story or its adaptations. However, this documentary does explore the darker historical realities, original literary elements, and emotional foundations that inspired the work, many of which were significantly sanitized in later mainstream portrayals. In other words, if your entire emotional stability depends on believing Peter Pan was just a happy little dude in tights flying around with a flashlight-sized fairy, this documentary may hit you like a piano falling off a Victorian rooftop. You have been warned. Now dim the lights, lock the nursery window, and roll the documentary.
Peter Pan. The fairy tale built on death. A Pizzaverse Studios documentary. A Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. Research, editing, and historical breakdown by the Pizzaverse Archives. Everyone knows Peter Pan. The magical boy who flies through nursery windows, sprinkles fairy dust, and promises children they never have to grow up. That's the version the world remembers. That's the version Disney sold. But buried underneath the bright animation, the catchy songs, and the fantasy of eternal youth is something far darker. Because the original Peter Pan wasn't a hero. He was forgetful, cruel, emotionally hollow. A creature who discarded children the moment they stopped serving his fantasy. And the man who created him? A psychologically shattered author haunted by death, obsession, grief, and a childhood trauma so devastating it consumed his entire identity. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't the fiction. It's the horrifying reality behind it. Because the real children who inspired Neverland, the real lost boys, would suffer tragedies so brutal that people eventually began whispering about a curse surrounding Peter Pan itself. This isn't a story about childhood wonder. This is a story about trauma frozen in time, and how one broken man turned grief into immortality. Let's get into it. The boy who never left the ice. Everyone knows Peter Pan as the boy who never grew up. But before there was Neverland, before there were lost boys, before fairy dust, pirate ships, nursery windows, and a shadow that wouldn't stay attached, there was a real child lying dead on the ice. And another little boy watching his whole family collapse around the body. This is where Peter Pan really begins. Not in magic. Not in adventure. Not in childhood wonder. but in Scotland in 1867, inside a family home that would never recover from one terrible accident. James Matthew Barrie was only 6 years old when his older brother David died. David was 13, one day away from turning 14. And in the Barrie household, David wasn't just another child. He was the golden boy, the favorite, the beloved son, the one their mother, Margaret Barrie, adored with a devotion so intense it left everyone else standing in the shadows. David was bright, handsome, promising. In Margaret's eyes, he was the future of the family. And then, just like that, the future cracked open on a frozen piece of ice. David was skating when he fell. A simple accident. One bad moment. One brutal twist of fate. And the boy Margaret loved most in the world was gone before he ever got the chance to become a man. That detail matters. Because David did not die at 40. He did not die old, tired, and finished with life. He died on the edge of becoming something else. He died right before his 14th birthday. Still a boy. Still untouched by adulthood. Still frozen in the mind of his mother as the perfect child who would never disappoint her, never leave her, never change, and never grow old. And that idea that a dead child remains a child forever would become the emotional wound that shaped everything J.M. Barrie would later create. Because after David died, Margaret Barrie didn't simply mourn. She disappeared. Not physically. She was still there in the house. Still breathing. Still occupying the room. But emotionally, psychologically, she vanished into the grave with her son. Margaret took to her bed in a darkened room, consumed by a grief so powerful it became the center of the entire household. The curtains were closed. The air grew heavy. The home became a mausoleum with furniture. And little James, only 6 years old, was left standing in the wreckage, trying to understand why the mother he needed could no longer see him. Imagine that. You are a child. Your brother dies. Your mother breaks. And instead of being held, instead of being comforted, instead of being told that you still matter, you become invisible. Because the dead child has become more powerful than the living one. That is the first real ghost in Peter Pan. Not Tinker Bell. Not shadows. Not pirates. David Barrie. The boy on the ice. The brother who never grew up. The child who became eternal because death stopped the clock. And James understood something terrible very early. If he wanted his mother's love back, he had to reach her through David. So he tried. God help him, he tried. He wore David's clothes. He imitated David's voice. He moved through the house like a little actor performing a séance for his own mother. He was not just grieving his brother, he was auditioning to replace him. That is not normal childhood pain. That is psychological survival. A little boy looked at his broken mother and realized the only version of himself she might love was the version that looked like the son she had lost. So James tried to become a dead boy. Let that sink in. Before J.M. Barrie ever wrote about a child who refuses to grow up, he lived inside a house where growing up seemed like betrayal. Because David would never grow older. David would never argue. David would never become difficult. David would never leave home. David would remain perfect forever. And to Margaret Barrie, in her shattered grief, that became a source of comfort. Her dead son would always be hers. Untouched by time, untouched by adulthood, untouched by the disappointment of becoming human. There it is, the seed of Neverland. A mother loses her favorite son and finds comfort in the idea that he will remain a boy forever. A surviving child sees this and learns that eternal boyhood is the only thing powerful enough to hold love. That is the emotional birthplace of Peter Pan. Not a fairy tale, a wound. And wounds like that don't just heal because the calendar keeps moving. They go underground. They become symbols. They become stories. They become monsters wearing green. As James grew older, the shadow of David never left him. How could it? His childhood had been rearranged around death. His mother's love had been trapped behind the image of a boy who could never grow up. And James had learned to associate childhood with safety, with affection, with permanence. Adulthood, by contrast, became threat. Adulthood meant change. Adulthood meant leaving. Adulthood meant losing the one thing his mother still worshipped, the frozen perfection of a dead child. So when people later looked at Peter Pan and saw whimsy, they were missing the corpse under the floorboards. Peter Pan was not born from innocence. He was born from a 6-year-old boy standing outside a dark bedroom, trying to resurrect his dead brother so his mother might love him again. That is the horror underneath the fantasy. Because when Peter says he never wants to grow up, the world hears rebellion. Freedom. Magic. But underneath that line is something much colder. A child who learned that the only boy his mother could fully love was the one who died before adulthood could ruin him. Because before Peter Pan could fly, David Barrie had to fall. Before Neverland could exist, a mother had to lose her son. And before the world could meet the boy who wouldn't grow up, James Matthew Barrie had to become the boy who never escaped the ice. A mother who never recovered. Grief changes people. Sometimes it softens them. Sometimes it hardens them. And sometimes it leaves them psychologically frozen in the exact moment their world ended. That is what happened to Margaret Barrie. And young James Matthew Barrie spent the rest of his life trapped inside the fallout. After David's death, the Barrie household no longer functioned like a normal family home. It became organized around absence. Everything revolved around the missing boy. The silence at the dinner table. The darkened bedroom. The emotional vacancy hanging over every room like funeral cloth. But the most devastating part wasn't the mourning itself. It was what Margaret Barrie chose to emotionally preserve. Because in her mind, David had become perfect. Not because he lived perfectly, but because he never lived long enough to disappoint her. Death had preserved him in emotional amber. Forever young. Forever innocent. Forever hers. That idea would poison James Barrie's understanding of love, adulthood, and identity for the rest of his life. Because every child understands one basic thing instinctively. What gets rewarded becomes survival. And what James saw rewarded inside that house was eternal childhood. The dead boy became sacred. The living boy became invisible. Margaret would reportedly speak about David as though he still existed somewhere just beyond reach. Not entirely gone, just inaccessible. Like a child sleeping in another room. And James absorbed this in the worst possible way. He did not merely mourn his brother. He began psychologically competing with a ghost. Imagine trying to win affection from someone who is in love with memory itself. You cannot compete with memory. Memory never ages. Memory never changes. Memory never argues. Memory never becomes flawed. And that is exactly what David became inside Margaret Barrie's mind. Not a real child anymore. A perfect symbol, a permanent child, the first Peter Pan. Meanwhile, James, still alive and growing older, became a painful reminder of reality continuing forward. And reality was the enemy now. Because reality meant David was truly gone. So Margaret emotionally retreated further and further into grief, while James desperately tried to follow her there. This is where the story stops being sad and starts becoming psychologically terrifying. Because James Barrie did not simply admire childhood after this, he began worshipping it. Childhood became emotionally sacred. Adulthood became contamination. Growing older meant separation. Growing older meant losing innocence. Growing older meant becoming mortal, sexual, independent, complicated, everything the dead David would never become. And once that idea takes root in a developing mind, it changes how you see humanity itself. Suddenly, adulthood is not growth. It is corruption. A fall from grace. A betrayal of the child you once were. That exact idea saturates Peter Pan like poison in the walls. The adults in Neverland are either foolish, cruel, absent, or monstrous. Captain Hook is literally adulthood personified, obsessed with time, terrified of death, stalked by a ticking clock he cannot escape. Meanwhile, Peter exists outside time entirely. No responsibility. No memory. No maturity. No consequences. Because in Barrie's emotional universe, adulthood was not liberation. It was doom. And the roots of that doom began in Margaret Barrie's bedroom after David died. The more historians examine Barrie's life, the clearer this pattern becomes. This was not simply a man writing imaginative stories about children. This was a man trying to psychologically preserve childhood itself. Trying to stop time. Trying to freeze innocence before reality could destroy it. Just as death had frozen David. And young James learned another dangerous lesson during these years. Love could vanish instantly. One accident. One fall. One terrible day. And the center of the household collapses forever. That creates a particular kind of fear inside a child. A fear of abandonment. A fear of change. A fear that emotional attachment itself is fragile and temporary. And Peter Pan reflects this constantly. Peter forgets people. He abandons people. He replaces people. He cannot maintain emotional continuity because emotionally stable attachment requires maturity, and maturity is the very thing Peter rejects. That is why Peter Pan's eternal youth is not freedom. It is psychological paralysis. Peter cannot grow because Barrie emotionally could not allow him to. Because growing up meant becoming vulnerable to loss. Because growing up meant becoming vulnerable to loss. And Barrie had already learned what loss looked like. It looked like a dark room, a grieving mother, a dead brother, and a little boy standing outside the door trying to become someone else just to be loved again. As the years passed, Margaret eventually emerged physically from her grief enough to function. But emotionally, something fundamental had broken. And James carried that fracture directly into adulthood. People later described Barrie as strangely childlike. Not playful in a healthy sense. Frozen. Stunted. As though part of him had never emotionally progressed past the moment David died. Because in many ways, it hadn't. Trauma does that. It traps part of the mind inside unfinished pain. And Barrie's trauma became so embedded in his identity that eventually it stopped being memory and became mythology. That mythology would become Neverland, a place where children escape adulthood forever, a place where mothers are longed for but unreachable, a place where memory fades before emotional consequences can settle in, a place where growing up is treated almost like death itself. But before Peter Pan became literature, it was a coping mechanism. A fantasy built by a man who never emotionally escaped the grief-stricken house of his childhood. And maybe that's why the story still unsettles people even when they can't explain why. Because underneath all the flying and fairy dust, Peter Pan is not really about adventure. It is about a child watching his mother emotionally choose the dead over the living. And learning that staying young forever might be the only way to remain loved. The man trapped inside a child. By the time James Matthew Barrie reached adulthood, something about him felt unfinished. People noticed it immediately. Not just emotionally. Physically. His body itself seemed caught somewhere between childhood and maturity, as though time had moved forward but some deeper part of him had refused to come along. Barrie stood only around 5'3". Small even by the standards of the late Victorian era. His voice remained unusually high and boyish well into adulthood. Friends described him as youthful in ways that gradually stopped seeming charming and started seeming unsettling. Like a man performing childhood instead of naturally possessing it. And the deeper people got to know Barrie, the stranger the pattern became. Because while the world would eventually celebrate him as the creator of one of the most beloved children's stories ever written, Barrie himself seemed psychologically incapable of becoming fully adult. Not symbolically. Literally. In 1894, Barrie married actress Mary Ansell. At first, it looked like the beginning of a conventional life. Successful playwright. Beautiful actress wife. London Literary Society. Respectability. But beneath the surface, something was profoundly wrong. The marriage slowly deteriorated into emotional distance and confusion. Then, eventually, humiliation. Because after years together, Mary would later reveal something shocking. The marriage had never been consummated. Not once. According to her, Barrie remained psychologically trapped in a state of emotional adolescence. Unable or unwilling to cross fully into adult intimacy. To modern readers, that revelation lands like a thunderclap. Because suddenly Peter Pan stops feeling metaphorical. The man who wrote endlessly about refusing adulthood appeared genuinely terrified of adulthood itself. Not just responsibility, not just aging, physical adulthood, sexual adulthood, emotional adulthood, the entire transition. And that changes the way you see everything he wrote afterward. Because Peter Pan isn't simply a fantasy character anymore. He becomes a projection, an escape hatch, a psychological survival mechanism created by a man who could not reconcile himself with becoming fully grown. Barrie's body became the symbol of the conflict consuming him internally. A small man with a child's voice wandering through upper-class London society, entertaining children, charming families, writing stories about eternal youth while emotionally orbiting around grief like a moon trapped in gravity. And underneath all of it was David. Always David. The dead brother frozen forever at 13. The ideal child who never crossed into adulthood. The standard James could never emotionally escape. Because adulthood represented something dangerous inside Barrie's mind. Loss. Decay. Corruption. Distance from innocence. The farther he moved from childhood, the farther he moved from the emotional center of his mother's love. And maybe that is why Barrie clung so desperately to worlds where children never changed. Because change had stolen everything from him once already. As his literary success grew, Barrie became famous for his ability to connect with children. Adults found him entertaining. Children adored him. He could perform voices, tell stories, invent games instantly. He moved through imagination effortlessly, like someone who genuinely belonged there more than he belonged among adults. And to the public, this made him seem whimsical, gentle, harmless. But viewed through the lens of his childhood trauma, the pattern becomes much darker. Barrie was not merely nostalgic for childhood. He was emotionally dependent on it. Childhood became the one place where he felt psychologically safe. A world untouched by sexuality, aging, betrayal, and mortality. A world before the ice. Before grief consumed his home. Before his mother emotionally vanished into mourning. And as Barrie built his career writing stories filled with children, fantasy, and escapism, another disturbing contradiction emerged. The more successful he became, the more isolated he appeared emotionally. Relationships struggled. Adult intimacy remained fractured. Real-world attachment became increasingly complicated. Meanwhile, his fictional worlds became more emotionally intense, more psychologically revealing, and more obsessed with preserving innocence against time itself. And nowhere is that obsession clearer than Peter Pan. Because Peter is not simply a child. Peter is a child who rejects humanity's natural progression entirely. He rejects memory. He rejects responsibility. He rejects emotional permanence. He rejects adulthood so completely that the story transforms eternal youth into something monstrous. Peter does not mature. He does not evolve. He does not learn. He repeats. Forever. That's not freedom. That's entrapment. And consciously or not, Barrie was writing himself into the character. A man emotionally circling the same unresolved grief for decades. Unable to fully leave childhood behind because childhood had become spiritually fused with love itself. And then came the moment that would transform this psychological fixation into something even more dangerous. Kensington Gardens. A park in London. A chance encounter. And 5 boys who would unknowingly become trapped inside Barrie's fantasy forever. The Llewellyn Davies children. The real lost boys. And once Barrie met them, the line between storytelling and emotional obsession would begin collapsing completely. Because Peter Pan was no longer just an idea living inside Barrie's mind. Now he had real children to build Neverland around. And eventually, those children would pay the price for it. The real lost boys. In the early 1900s, Kensington Gardens was one of the most fashionable public spaces in London. Elegant paths, tree-lined walkways, nursemaids pushing prams beneath the fog, upper-class families strolling through carefully maintained gardens while the British Empire sat at the height of its power. To most people, it was simply a park. To James Matthew Barrie, it became the doorway to Neverland. Because it was here, wandering through Kensington Gardens with his massive St. Bernard dog, Porthos, that Barrie encountered the family who would permanently alter both his life and literary history. Sylvia and Arthur Llewellyn Davies. And their 5 sons, George, Jack, Peter, Michael, and Nicholas. The boys who would become the real lost boys. At first glance, the meeting seemed innocent enough. Barrie had a talent for instantly captivating children. He could wiggle his ears, perform little theatrical routines, invent stories on the spot. He spoke to children as though he existed naturally inside their imaginative world instead of merely visiting it from adulthood. To Victorian society, this made him appear charming, endearing, a whimsical literary figure with a gift for connecting to childhood wonder. And to the Davies boys, he quickly became Uncle Jim. But underneath the warmth and fantasy, something far more psychologically complicated was beginning to form. Because Barrie did not simply enjoy entertaining children. He emotionally needed them. Not in the simplistic caricature people sometimes reduce the story to today. Something stranger. Something harder to define. The Davies boys represented an emotional doorway back into the childhood Barrie lost when David died. A living recreation of innocence, of play, of youth untouched by grief and adulthood. And Barrie became deeply attached to them with astonishing speed. Especially Michael. Always Michael. The sensitive, dreamy child who reminded Barrie most of the eternal boyhood he worshipped psychologically. Soon the games in Kensington Gardens became elaborate rituals of imagination. Pirates. Shipwrecks. Island kingdoms. Red Indians, as Victorian children unfortunately called them at the time. Battles. Adventures. Fantasy worlds stretching endlessly beneath the London trees. Barrie documented everything obsessively. Their conversations. Their personalities. Their invented worlds. He filled notebooks with details, transforming real children into literary raw material. And here is where the line between affection and artistic possession starts becoming difficult to separate. Because the Davies boys were not merely inspiring Peter Pan, Barrie was immortalizing them, freezing them permanently inside fiction before real life could change them, before they could grow older, before adulthood could arrive, and maybe most importantly, before they could leave him emotionally. That is the hidden engine underneath Peter Pan. Fear of abandonment. Fear of change. Fear of losing children to time itself. Because Barrie already knew what loss looked like. He had spent his entire life haunted by it. And now, standing in Kensington Gardens, watching the Davies boys play beneath the trees, he found something dangerously close to emotional resurrection. A second chance at the lost innocence of childhood. Only this time he could preserve it forever through storytelling. In 1901, Barrie published The Little White Bird, introducing an early version of Peter Pan living among birds and fairies in Kensington Gardens. The idea exploded from there. The park itself slowly transformed inside Barrie's imagination into Neverland before Neverland even had a name. Then, in 1904, Peter Pan, or The Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up, premiered on stage. And London lost its mind. Audiences were enchanted immediately. Children flying over rooftops. Pirates. Mermaids. Adventure. Fantasy. The dream of escaping adulthood forever. Critics called it magical, visionary, timeless. But almost nobody noticed the sadness embedded inside it. The emotional rot underneath the wonder. Because Peter Pan is not a happy character. He is emotionally hollow, forgetful, cruel, detached. He cannot maintain relationships because relationships require growth and memory. And Peter rejects both. Even then, Barrie was quietly embedding disturbing ideas into the story. Peter forgets the lost boys. Forgets Tinker Bell. Forgets Wendy. Children are interchangeable. Replaceable. Temporary. Peter doesn't love people in a mature sense. He consumes experiences. And once the moment passes, so do they. That emotional emptiness mirrors something terrifying about unresolved childhood trauma. When emotional development freezes early, attachment itself can become unstable. People become symbols instead of individuals. Fantasy replaces intimacy. And that emotional instability bleeds through Peter Pan constantly, once you know where to look. Meanwhile, the Davies boys watched themselves become immortalized in fiction while still alive. Imagine that. You are a child playing games in a park. And suddenly the entire world knows versions of you that will never age. Never die. Never change. The public saw fantasy. Barrie saw preservation. A way to freeze childhood before reality could destroy it, the way it destroyed David. But reality was already moving toward the family. Toward tragedy. Toward death. And just like the original wound in Barrie's life, it would begin with losing a father. Arthur Llewellyn Davies became ill first. Cancer. Slow. cruel. Barrie inserted himself deeper and deeper into the family during the illness, helping financially, emotionally, socially, becoming increasingly essential, increasingly attached, increasingly embedded inside the lives of the boys. Then, in 1907, Arthur died. The Davies household shattered. And suddenly, Barrie was no longer simply a family friend. He was becoming something else. A permanent presence. 3 years later, Sylvia died too. Cancer again. Now the boys were truly orphaned. The fantasy had become reality. The real Lost Boys no longer had parents. And standing there waiting in the aftermath was J.M. Barrie, the creator of Peter Pan, the man obsessed with eternal childhood, the man who had emotionally built Neverland around these children. And now, through death itself, they belonged to him. Neverland enters the real world. By 1910, the line between fiction and reality had almost completely disappeared. The story Barrie created about orphaned boys escaping adulthood was no longer just literature being performed on a stage. It was happening in real life. Arthur Llewellyn Davies was dead. Sylvia Llewellyn Davies was dead. And the 5 boys who inspired Peter Pan now found themselves living inside a nightmare version of Neverland. No father. No mother. No stable home untouched by grief. Only Uncle Jim, the man who had transformed their childhood into mythology. To the outside world, Barrie appeared heroic, a devoted guardian stepping in to care for orphaned children after unimaginable tragedy. And to be fair, Barrie did provide for them financially. He paid for education, housing, opportunities. He remained deeply involved in their lives for years. But beneath the generosity sat a relationship so emotionally tangled that historians are still debating its true nature over a century later. Because Barrie was not simply helping the Davies boys survive. He was preserving them. Emotionally. Psychologically. Almost spiritually. The boys had become fused with Peter Pan itself. And Barrie seemed incapable of separating the real children from the fantasy versions living inside his imagination. The deeper you look into the history, the stranger it becomes. Especially the issue surrounding Sylvia's will. Officially, Sylvia intended for the boys to remain in the care of their longtime nanny, Jenny Hodgson, alongside Barrie's support. But after Sylvia's death, Barrie claimed the will referenced Jimmy, his nickname, rather than Jenny. That tiny difference changed everything. Suddenly, Barrie gained enormous authority over the boys' upbringing. And while some historians believe it may have been a misunderstanding or clerical confusion, others have questioned whether Barrie intentionally manipulated the wording. There is no definitive proof, but the ambiguity itself has haunted Peter Pan's scholarship for decades, because it creates an unsettling parallel with the story Barrie himself wrote. Peter Pan stealing children away from home, separating them emotionally from their parents, convincing them they belong in Neverland instead. And now, in real life, Barrie had effectively acquired the boys who inspired the Lost Boys after both parents died. The symbolism is almost too perfect, too disturbing. It feels less like literature and more like mythology swallowing reality whole. And the boys themselves, they were trapped inside the emotional gravity of Barrie's world, whether they wanted to be or not. Imagine growing up while the entire planet associates your childhood with one of the most famous stories ever written. Imagine trying to become an adult while the world constantly drags you backward into the identity of the real Lost Boys. That kind of psychological burden reshapes people, especially children already traumatized by grief. And Barrie's influence over the family became overwhelming. He visited constantly, wrote letters obsessively, inserted himself into nearly every aspect of their emotional lives. The boys depended on him financially and socially, but emotionally the relationship became increasingly difficult to define. Was he a father figure? A brother figure? An emotionally arrested man desperately trying to preserve childhood through proximity? Maybe all three at once. And this is where modern audiences struggle with the Peter Pan story. Because people want clean categories. Hero. Villain. Predator. Innocent eccentric. But real human psychology is uglier than that. Messier. Barrie seems less like a cartoon monster and more like a profoundly damaged human being who built emotional dependency around children because adulthood terrified him. That does not erase the disturbing aspects of the story. If anything, it makes them worse. Because now Peter Pan stops feeling fictional altogether. It begins feeling autobiographical. Neverland is Barrie's emotional refuge. A place where children stay children. Where mothers are idealized but unreachable. Where time stops before grief, sexuality, adulthood, and separation can destroy innocence. And the Davies boys became trapped inside that emotional system. Especially Michael. Always Michael. Barrie's attachment to Michael Llewellyn Davies became so intense that even historians uncomfortable with speculation acknowledge the emotional dependency was extraordinary. Their letters reveal deep affection, emotional intimacy, and a bond that often blurred the line between mentorship and something psychologically consuming. Barrie once described himself in a letter to Michael as a greasy candle bent in the middle. The phrase feels strange. Broken. Almost grotesque. A man describing himself as something melted and warped by heat. And then came the line that continues to unsettle scholars to this day. I am very fond of you, but don't tell anybody. That sentence hangs over the Peter Pan story like fog. Not because it proves criminality. There is no definitive evidence Barrie physically abused the boys. But emotionally, psychologically, the relationship carried an intensity that feels increasingly claustrophobic the deeper you examine it. Especially because Barrie's entire emotional identity revolved around preserving innocence against time. And Michael represented innocence perfectly to him. Dreamy. Sensitive. Youthful. Fragile. A real-life embodiment of Peter Pan himself. But innocence cannot stay frozen forever. Reality always enters eventually. Puberty. Adulthood. Depression. Sexuality. War. death. And the moment the Davies boys began growing older, the fantasy started collapsing. The Curse of Neverland. At first, it looked like coincidence. Tragic coincidence. The kind of bad luck families sometimes suffer without explanation. But as the years passed and the deaths kept coming, whispers started forming around the Peter Pan story. Quiet whispers at first, then darker ones. People began noticing something disturbing. The real lost boys were not surviving adulthood. And for a story obsessed with eternal youth, that detail felt horrifyingly symbolic. The first major blow came with George Llewellyn Davies. George was the eldest. Handsome. Intelligent. Responsible. The closest thing the brothers had to stability after their parents died. Barrie adored him. The public adored him. And like countless young men of his generation, George marched directly into the machinery of World War I. The war shattered Europe like a dropped mirror. Millions of young men disappeared into trenches, mud, gas, artillery fire, and industrialized slaughter. Boyhood died there by the millions. And in 1915, George Llewellyn Davies became one more name swallowed by the nightmare. He was killed in action at just 21 years old. 21? Old enough to wear a uniform. Not old enough to truly live. For Barrie, George's death reopened the oldest wound in his life. Another beloved young man frozen permanently before adulthood could fully arrive. Another boy transformed into memory instead of future. And if George's death wounded Barrie, Michael's death destroyed him completely. Because Michael was different. Michael was the favorite. Closest emotionally to Barrie. The boy who most embodied the spirit of Peter Pan itself. Sensitive. Dreamlike. Gentle. Almost unnervingly ethereal. Barrie saw something of himself in Michael. Perhaps the child he wished he could have remained forever. But as Michael grew older, shadows started appearing around him. Darkness. Melancholy. Something restless underneath the surface. At Oxford University, Michael began struggling with chronic insomnia. Nightmares. Recurring dreams about drowning. Not vague fears. Specific visions. Water filling his lungs. Being pulled beneath the surface. Unable to escape. He wrote to Barrie about these dreams repeatedly. And the letters grew increasingly disturbing over time. Michael described feeling pursued by something he could not explain. A shadow. A pull toward the water. A strange emotional exhaustion that seemed deeper than ordinary sadness. And here the Peter Pan story becomes almost unbearably eerie. Because Peter Pan is filled with water imagery. Mermaids. Pirates. Lagoons. The ocean surrounding Neverland itself. Children drifting away from reality into dreamlike spaces where time no longer functions properly. And now Michael, the boy most connected emotionally to Barrie, was dreaming obsessively about drowning. As though the fantasy itself had become infected with death. Then came May 19th, 1921. The day the nightmare finally reached the surface. Michael traveled to Sandford Loch on the Thames River with his close friend Rupert Buxton. Locals already knew the place by another name, Dead Man's Pool. A dangerous stretch of water notorious for vicious currents and suspicious drownings. The kind of place people whispered about. The kind of place associated with endings. Both young men were weak swimmers. Both had reportedly been drinking. Witnesses later claimed they spoke openly that day about exhaustion, hopelessness, and never wanting to grow old. Then the two entered the water together, fully clothed, at the most dangerous section of the river. And according to reports, they did not fight to survive. They simply sank, holding each other. The official ruling called it accidental drowning, but almost nobody truly believed it, especially after rumors spread that Rupert Buxton left behind a note immediately destroyed by his family. Whatever was written inside it vanished forever, and the image left behind became impossible to shake. Two young men entering dark water together at the exact age Peter Pan promises eternal youth. 21. The same age George died. The same age adulthood was only just beginning. And suddenly, the symbolism surrounding Peter Pan stopped feeling literary. It began feeling cursed. Because Michael's death mirrors the emotional logic of Neverland almost perfectly. A refusal to enter adulthood. A surrender to dreamlike escape. A final drifting away from reality itself. And for Barrie, the psychological impact was catastrophic. His diary entry after Michael's death contained only 8 words. "Michael gone, all my world gone with him." That sentence tells you everything. Not just grief. Collapse. The emotional center of Barrie's life had been ripped away completely. Michael had become the final living embodiment of the fantasy Barrie spent decades trying to preserve. And now even he was gone. Swallowed by dark water like a fairy tale turning on its creator. After Michael's death, Peter Pan itself began changing in the public imagination. People still loved the play, still adored the fantasy, but underneath the cultural affection sat growing unease. Because once you know the real history, the story becomes impossible to experience innocently again. The Lost Boys stop feeling whimsical. They start feeling doomed. Children trapped in suspended animation while death circles outside the boundaries of fantasy. And Michael's death left another terrifying question hanging over the entire Peter Pan mythos. What if Neverland was never paradise? What if it was emotional surrender? A place people retreat to when reality becomes unbearable. A world where memory fades, time stops, and adulthood never arrives because tomorrow itself no longer matters. That interpretation changes Peter Pan completely. Because now eternal childhood stops sounding magical. It starts sounding fatal. And the tragedy was not over yet, because the boy who gave Peter Pan his very name was still alive. Still growing older. Still trapped beneath the shadow of a story that had consumed his entire identity. And eventually, Peter Llewellyn Davies would decide he could not escape Neverland either. The boy who couldn't escape his own name. Imagine spending your entire life being haunted by a fictional version of yourself, not a nickname, not a rumor, a global myth. That was the reality Peter Llewellyn Davies lived with until the day he died. Because unlike his brothers, Peter carried the heaviest burden of all. He gave Peter Pan his name, and the world never let him forget it. From the outside, people assumed it must have felt magical, romantic, immortalizing, the real Peter Pan. What child wouldn't want that? But the truth was far uglier, because Peter Llewellyn-Davies hated the association almost from the very beginning. As he grew older, the character became less like a compliment and more like a prison sentence. Everywhere he went, the shadow followed him. Business meetings, social gatherings, relationships. Strangers would hear his name, freeze for a moment, and smile with recognition. Oh my God, Peter Pan. Not Peter Llewellyn-Davies, the human being. Not Peter the adult. Not Peter the man trying to build a life. Peter the symbol. Peter the eternal child. The world refused to let him grow up, and over time that emotional suffocation hollowed him out. He reportedly referred to the play as that terrible masterpiece. Think about how loaded those words are. Terrible, not because the work failed, because it succeeded too completely. The story became so massive, so culturally immortal, that it devoured the identities of the real children behind it, especially his own. And this is where the Peter Pan myth becomes almost psychologically cruel, because the entire story is about escaping adulthood, while the real people attached to it were being psychologically crushed by the inability to escape childhood. Peter drank heavily as he grew older. Friends described long depressive episodes, sudden bursts of rage, bitterness whenever Barrie or Peter Pan entered conversation. Even his own children later recalled how deeply the story disturbed him. Mentioning Peter Pan could trigger visible emotional reactions, as though he were living beside a ghost nobody else could see. And maybe he was, because Peter Llewellyn-Davies had spent his life trapped inside someone else's fantasy. Imagine trying to become a normal adult when your childhood has already been preserved forever in public imagination. You cannot escape it. The world keeps dragging you backward, back toward innocence, back toward nostalgia, back toward the fictional child version of yourself. And eventually, the psychological weight became unbearable. By the 1950s, Peter's mental state had deteriorated severely. Depression deepened. Alcohol became constant. The burden of being the real Peter Pan turned into something almost existential. Not just embarrassment, identity collapse. Because who are you when the world already decided your symbolic meaning before you became an adult? Who are you when your own childhood belongs more to literature than to you? And then came April 5th, 1960. Peter Llewellyn-Davies was 63 years old, an old man now, far older than Barrie ever emotionally allowed Peter Pan to become. But even at 63, he still could not escape the shadow of eternal childhood. That day, Peter walked to Sloane Square Underground Station in London. Witnesses later described him standing near the platform quietly. No dramatic speech, no theatrical breakdown, just exhaustion. Then he stepped forward into the path of an approaching train, and just like that, the boy whose name became immortal in fantasy was gone beneath steel, noise, and darkness. The symbolism feels almost too brutal to be real. Peter Pan, the story about escaping adulthood, forever ends with the real Peter throwing himself beneath modern machinery after decades of psychological exhaustion. No fairy dust, no flight. No Neverland, just a train tunnel in London, cold reality swallowing fantasy whole. After his death, one detail from Peter's final writings struck people especially hard. He reportedly described the entire Peter Pan phenomenon as a terrible burden on our family. Not blessing, not legacy, burden. That single word changes everything, because suddenly the story stops feeling like harmless cultural mythology and starts looking like inherited emotional trauma passed from one generation to another. And Peter was not the only survivor permanently scarred by Barrie's world. Jack Llewellyn Davies survived into old age but refused nearly every interview about Peter Pan or Barrie. His silence became legendary. Researchers, journalists, historians all turned away, as though speaking about the past itself had become unbearable. And Nicholas, the youngest brother, spent much of his adult life defending Barrie publicly against accusations and implications surrounding the family dynamic. Some historians interpret this as loyalty. Others see something more psychologically complicated. A lifelong need to protect the mythology, because admitting the emotional damage underneath it would mean confronting painful truths about his entire childhood. Either way, the pattern surrounding the brothers remains impossible to ignore. George dies at 21 in war. Michael drowns at 21 under deeply suspicious circumstances. Peter spends his life psychologically collapsing beneath the identity forced onto him before dying by suicide. Jack retreats into silence. Nicholas spends his adulthood defending the man who emotionally shaped their lives. And suddenly the Lost Boys no longer feel fictional. They feel prophetic. Like children trapped inside an emotional system none of them could fully escape. Which raises a horrifying possibility. What if Peter Pan was never really about preserving childhood? What if it was about preserving grief? Because grief freezes people. It traps them emotionally inside moments they cannot move beyond. And Barrie, consciously or not, may have built an entire mythology around that emotional paralysis. Neverland is not heaven. Neverland is suspension. A place where nobody heals because nobody changes. Nobody matures. Nobody moves forward. And eventually, that emotional stagnation becomes suffocating. Especially in the real world, where time keeps moving whether you are psychologically prepared for it or not. But the darkest part of the Peter Pan story was still waiting inside Barrie's original text itself. Because once you strip away the Disney version, once you go back to the actual novel, Peter Pan stops feeling tragic and starts feeling monstrous. Disney lied to you. Most people think they know Peter Pan. They picture the Disney version. The smiling boy in green. The crowing. The flying. The playful adventures. The mischievous hero leading children through magical escapades in Neverland. That version has become so dominant that it has effectively replaced the original character in public memory. But if you go back to Barrie's actual text, the mask comes off. And what you find underneath is something far more disturbing. Because Peter Pan is not a hero. He is not a protector. He is not even particularly kind. In fact, much of the original Peter Pan reads less like a whimsical fairy tale and more like a psychological horror story disguised as children's literature. The single most chilling example appears in a line that Disney quietly left behind. A line so unsettling that modern adaptations rarely touch it. Barrie writes that when the Lost Boys begin showing signs of growing up, which is against the rules, Peter thins them out. That's it. No detailed explanation. No comforting clarification. Just 4 horrifying words. He thins them out. And somehow the vagueness makes it worse. Because what exactly does that mean? Where do they go? What happens to them? Why does nobody question it? Barrie never fully answers. But the implication hangs over the entire story like a storm cloud. Children who stop being children disappear. Children who grow older are removed. Children who no longer fit the fantasy are eliminated. Suddenly, Neverland doesn't sound like paradise anymore. It sounds like a dictatorship run by a child who cannot tolerate reality. And once you notice that detail, Peter's entire personality starts looking different. Much different. Throughout the story, Peter repeatedly displays traits that feel shockingly cold. He forgets people. He abandons people. He treats relationships as temporary amusements. Even those who sacrifice everything for him eventually vanish from his memory. Take Tinker Bell. In many adaptations, her death is treated as a heartbreaking act of devotion. She literally sacrifices herself to save Peter. A defining moment of loyalty and love. But Peter eventually forgets her. Not because he's grieving. Not because he's devastated. Because forgetting is simply what Peter does. The same pattern repeats with Wendy. With the Lost Boys. With everyone. People pass through his life like ghosts moving through fog. The emotional impact barely registers. Because Peter isn't truly attached to individuals. He's attached to experiences. The moment the experience ends, the person becomes disposable. That detail changes everything. Because suddenly Peter stops looking like a child. He starts looking like something imitating a child. A creature wearing innocence as camouflage. And the deeper you dig into Barrie's writing, the stranger Peter becomes. He is impulsive, narcissistic, self-centered, often cruel without realizing it. He struggles to understand consequences. He struggles to empathize with other people's emotions. He wants companionship but cannot maintain genuine relationships. He wants loyalty but offers very little in return. Most importantly, he cannot tolerate change. At all. Growing older is forbidden. Maturity is forbidden. Development is forbidden. Anything that threatens the eternal present of Neverland becomes an enemy. And when you remember Barrie's childhood trauma, the symbolism becomes impossible to miss. Peter Pan isn't merely a child refusing adulthood. He is grief refusing reality. He is trauma refusing healing. He is emotional paralysis transformed into a literary character. Because growth requires accepting loss. Growth requires accepting change. Growth requires accepting that childhood ends. Barrie spent his entire life struggling with those truths. And Peter Pan embodies that struggle perfectly. The character exists in permanent opposition to human development itself. The character exists in permanent opposition to human development itself. But perhaps the darkest realization is this: Peter Pan doesn't save children from adulthood. He steals adulthood from children. That's a very different thing. The Disney version sells eternal youth as freedom. Barrie's version increasingly resembles imprisonment. A world where children never become adults because they are never allowed to become anything else. A world where identity freezes. Memory erodes. relationships vanish, and growth becomes a punishable offense. In psychological terms, Neverland begins to look less like fantasy and more like stagnation. A beautiful prison. An island where nothing changes because change itself is treated as death. And that brings us to an even more disturbing question. If Peter is willing to remove children who grow up, if he forgets people the moment they stop serving his fantasy, if he sees relationships as temporary, then what exactly does Peter want? The answer lies in another detail Disney quietly erased. A detail involving the darling children's bedroom window. And it reveals something chilling about the way Peter views love, family, and belonging. Because in Barrie's original version, Peter doesn't just invite children into Neverland. He actively tries to convince them they have nowhere else to go. The window, the bars, and the kidnapping. One of the biggest differences between the Peter Pan most people know and the Peter Pan Barrie actually wrote comes down to a single question. How does Peter get children to stay in Neverland? Disney's answer is simple: adventure, magic, freedom, fun. Barrie's answer is far darker: isolation, manipulation, and emotional dependency. Because hidden inside the original story is a detail so disturbing that most modern adaptations quietly ignore it. A detail that fundamentally changes how Peter operates. At one point, Peter returns ahead of the darling children and places iron bars across their nursery window. Think about that for a moment. The window represents home, safety, family, a connection to the people who love them. Peter deliberately tries to make Wendy and the others believe they have been locked out. Abandoned, rejected, unwanted. He wants them to think their parents no longer care. Because if they believe they have nowhere else to go, they belong entirely to him. That is not the behavior of a heroic child. That is the behavior of someone attempting to sever emotional attachments. And once you recognize it, Neverland starts looking less like a magical destination and more like a psychological trap. Peter does not simply offer an alternative world. He tries to eliminate competing worlds. Home becomes the enemy. Parents become obstacles. Growing up becomes betrayal. Everything outside Neverland becomes a threat to Peter's control. And suddenly the Lost Boys take on an entirely different meaning. Because the Lost Boys are not merely children having adventures. They are children disconnected from their families. Disconnected from adulthood. Disconnected from any future that exists outside Peter's fantasy. They live in a permanent present. A world where Peter is always the center. Always the leader. Always the one who decides the rules. It is an unsettling dynamic. And the more historians examined Barrie's real life, the more some began noticing uncomfortable parallels. Because by the time Sylvia Llewellyn Davies died in 1910, Barrie had become deeply embedded in the lives of the boys who inspired Peter Pan. Their parents were gone. The family structure had collapsed. And Barrie became one of the most influential figures remaining in their lives. Again, there is no evidence that Barrie physically kidnapped anyone. But emotionally, the symbolism becomes difficult to ignore. A man obsessed with preserving childhood acquires extraordinary influence over the children who inspired his fantasy about boys who never grow up. A man who writes about children being separated from their parents suddenly finds himself helping raise orphaned boys. A man whose greatest fear appears to be adulthood surrounds himself with children standing on the edge of becoming adults. Reality begins mirroring fiction in increasingly uncomfortable ways. And then there is Barrie's relationship with motherhood itself. Throughout Peter Pan, mothers occupy a strange position. They are idealized, longed for, almost worshipped. Yet they remain unreachable. Peter repeatedly circles around the concept of maternal love without ever truly possessing it, which makes perfect sense when viewed through the lens of Barrie's childhood. His mother's love became psychologically inaccessible after David died. She was physically present, emotionally absent, always looking backward, always grieving, always focused on the child who would never return. Peter Pan is filled with children searching for mothers, missing mothers, returning to mothers, being abandoned by mothers. The emotional wound appears everywhere. And perhaps that is why Peter reacts so aggressively when children try to leave Neverland. Leaving means returning to reality, returning to family, returning to growth, returning to a life that exists beyond Peter himself. And Peter cannot tolerate that, because Peter's entire existence depends on suspension. The moment children reconnect with reality, his fantasy begins to collapse. That is why Wendy eventually becomes such a threat. Wendy matures. Wendy changes. Wendy develops an identity beyond Peter's world. She grows up. And growth is the one thing Peter Pan can never allow. Because growth destroys Neverland. Growth destroys the illusion. Growth destroys the fantasy that childhood can be preserved forever. The irony is almost tragic. Peter claims to offer freedom, but everyone around him becomes trapped. The Lost Boys are trapped. Wendy is trapped. Tinker Bell is trapped. Even Peter himself is trapped. No one moves forward. No one develops. No one heals. They simply repeat the same cycle endlessly. And that repetition reveals something important about Barrie's psychology. Because trauma works exactly that way. Trauma traps people in loops. The same fears. The same memories. The same emotional wounds replaying over and over again. Neverland is not a place where time stops. It is a place where emotional development stops. The monster wearing a child's face. The longer you stare at the original Peter Pan, the stranger he becomes. Not metaphorically, literally. Because Barrie does not consistently describe Peter like a normal child. He describes him like something pretending to be one. That distinction matters, especially once you strip away the softened Disney image the modern world inherited. In Barrie's text, Peter often behaves less like a boy and more like a creature mimicking human innocence from the outside. His emotions are incomplete. His empathy is unstable. His memory barely functions. And even his body refuses to behave naturally. At one point, Barrie describes Peter's breathing as fast and short. Not the calm breathing of a sleeping child. Not even the nervous breathing of excitement. Something sharper. Animalistic. Almost frantic. Like a small predator constantly alert for danger. Then Barrie introduces another detail that feels bizarrely unsettling once you slow down and think about it. Peter's body changes shape. Barrie writes that Peter can alter himself to fit through tiny openings and tree hollows throughout Neverland. That is not normal fantasy imagery for a child protagonist. It sounds almost inhuman, elastic, distorted, like Peter's form itself is unstable, as though he is not entirely solid, not entirely real. And when you combine those physical descriptions with Peter's emotional behavior, the character starts becoming genuinely eerie. Because Peter Pan does not operate like a healthy child psychologically. Healthy children form attachments. They grow emotionally. They develop identity over time through memory and relationships. Peter does none of that. He forgets people constantly, not casually. Pathologically, Barrie repeatedly emphasizes that Peter's memory resets almost immediately after experiences happen. Adventures disappear. People disappear. Emotions disappear. Even death disappears. That is one of the darkest aspects of the original story. The Lost Boys may die. Tinker Bell may die. Entire relationships may vanish. And Peter simply moves on. No grief. No processing. No emotional continuity. It is as though his mind refuses permanence itself. And suddenly Peter's eternal childhood stops looking magical. Because memory is part of what makes us human. Memory creates attachment, identity, responsibility, love. Without memory, relationships become disposable, temporary, weightless. Peter exists in a permanent emotional present where nothing accumulates long enough to truly matter. That is not innocence. That is isolation. And Barrie seems painfully aware of it. In fact, some literary scholars argue Peter Pan is less a celebration of childhood and more a warning about emotional emptiness. Because Peter's refusal to grow up comes with a horrifying cost. He cannot truly connect to anyone. Not permanently. Not deeply. Not honestly. Every person becomes temporary entertainment. Every friendship becomes replaceable. Every emotional moment evaporates the second it passes. Peter Pan is trapped in a loop of endless first meetings. Imagine that kind of loneliness. You can fly. You never age. You never die. But every meaningful connection eventually disappears from your mind like smoke. You are emotionally incapable of carrying love forward through time. You wake up every day psychologically alone again. That is not freedom. That is existential horror. And the deeper you examine Barrie's life, the more Peter begins resembling a symbolic expression of trauma itself. Because unresolved trauma often fractures memory. It traps people emotionally inside isolated moments. The past becomes fragmented. Connections become unstable. Emotional growth freezes. Peter Pan embodies all of those symptoms. He cannot move forward emotionally because Barrie could not fully move forward emotionally. Part of Barrie remained psychologically trapped beside the death of his brother forever. And Peter reflects that fragmentation constantly. He exists outside normal human progression, outside time, outside development, outside consequence. Even Peter's victories feel strangely empty once you notice this pattern. He defeats pirates. He flies. He has adventures. But nothing changes him. Nothing deepens him. Nothing stays with him. There is no emotional evolution. Only repetition. Over and over again. Adventure after adventure. Child after child. Memory after memory dissolving into nothing. And perhaps the cruelest example of this emotional emptiness comes at the end of the story itself. Years pass. Wendy grows older. She becomes an adult. A mother. The exact future Peter fears most. Then one day Peter returns. And he does not remember her properly. Not really. The adventures they shared meant everything to Wendy. To Peter, they barely exist. And then comes the final devastating realization. Peter no longer wants Wendy. He wants Wendy's daughter. Later, her granddaughter. Because Peter is not attached to individual people. He is attached to youth itself. Children become interchangeable. Replaceable batteries feeding the fantasy of eternal childhood. And suddenly Peter Pan transforms from tragic fantasy into something deeply predatory on a symbolic level. A creature endlessly consuming innocence while remaining emotionally incapable of love. Not because he is evil in the traditional sense. Because he is empty. Frozen. Incomplete. Exactly like unresolved grief itself. That may be the darkest truth Barrie accidentally revealed. Peter Pan is not really alive. He is emotionally suspended. A ghost wearing the shape of a child. And maybe that is why the story still unsettles people, even when they cannot explain why. Because somewhere underneath the fairy dust and adventure, Peter Pan feels wrong. Not whimsical wrong. Ancient wrong. Like something smiling that does not fully understand human emotion, but desperately imitates it anyway. And perhaps Barrie understood that better than anyone. Because by the end of his life, Peter Pan no longer looked like fantasy. It looked like confession. The confession disguised as a fairy tale. By the time James Matthew Barrie reached old age, Peter Pan had become immortal. The play was a phenomenon. The book was beloved. Children around the world knew the name. Parents embraced the story. The character had escaped its creator and entered mythology. On the surface, it looked like the ultimate literary success. A writer creates a character so powerful that generations continue telling the story long after he is gone. But beneath that success sat a question that becomes harder and harder to ignore once you know the history. What exactly was Barrie trying to tell us? Because when you strip away the fantasy, Peter Pan begins to read less like entertainment and more like autobiography. Not a literal autobiography. An emotional one. A coded confession. A map of psychological wounds disguised as children's literature. Every major element traces back to something broken inside Barrie's life. The dead boy who never grows up. The mother who cannot let go. the terror of adulthood, the longing to preserve innocence, the fear of abandonment, the inability to sustain healthy emotional attachment. All of it is there, hidden in plain sight. Peter Pan is not merely a story Barrie invented. It is a story Barrie lived. And perhaps nowhere is that more obvious than in Peter himself. Think about what Peter actually represents. He never grows up. Neither did David Barrie in his mother's memory. He cannot maintain relationships. Neither could Barrie fully navigate adult intimacy. He forgets people. Barrie spent decades emotionally circling around lost childhood and vanished connections. He rejects adulthood. Barrie seemed psychologically terrified of it. The parallels become impossible to dismiss. Peter Pan is not simply a fictional character. He is the embodiment of an emotional wound, the living expression of grief refusing to heal. And that grief shaped everything around Barrie. The Davies boys, the mythology, the obsession with eternal youth, even the public's understanding of childhood itself. Because before Peter Pan, childhood was often viewed as a stage people passed through. After Peter Pan, childhood became something many people began romanticizing as an ideal state. A paradise lost. An identity worth preserving forever. Barrie helped create one of the most powerful cultural myths of the modern world. That growing up is somehow tragic. That adulthood is a fall from grace. That innocence is more valuable than maturity. And while those ideas sound beautiful on the surface, the history behind them reveals something darker. Because refusing to grow is not the same as staying innocent. Refusing to grow means refusing change, refusing responsibility, refusing healing, refusing reality. And reality eventually catches everyone, even Barrie. As the decades passed, the tragedies surrounding the Davies family accumulated like ghosts. George dead. Michael dead. Peter dead. The surviving brothers carrying emotional scars for the rest of their lives. The real Lost Boys never found a happy ending. At least not the kind fairy tales promise. Instead, they became living reminders that childhood cannot be preserved forever without consequences. The very thing Barrie spent his life trying to protect ultimately became inseparable from loss. And then there is the final irony. One of the strangest ironies in literary history. When Barrie died in 1937, he left the copyright to Peter Pan to Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children in London. On the surface, it was a generous act. And it was. The royalties generated by Peter Pan helped fund medical treatment for countless sick children. The story continues helping children to this day. But the symbolism is impossible to ignore. A story born from grief. A story haunted by death. A story built upon the psychological wreckage of a family tragedy. Helping save the lives of children facing death themselves. It is almost poetic. Almost redemptive. As though the darkness that created Peter Pan spent the next century trying to repay a debt. Yet even that redemption cannot erase the uncomfortable truth at the center of the story. Peter Pan was never really about adventure. Adventure was the wrapping paper. The real gift hidden inside was grief. Everything leads back to grief. the death of David, Margaret's emotional collapse, Barrie's lifelong fixation on childhood, the lost boys, the fear of growing older, the inability to let go, the longing to freeze time. Peter Pan is grief transformed into mythology. And once you see that, the story changes forever. The flying becomes escape. The fairy dust becomes denial. Neverland becomes emotional suspension. The lost boys become children trapped between memory and reality. And Peter himself becomes something tragic rather than magical. A boy who can never grow. Because the man who created him never fully escaped the moment that made him. A 6-year-old child standing outside a dark room, desperately trying to become his dead brother so his mother would love him again. That child never completely disappeared. He simply learned how to write. And through Peter Pan, he told the world exactly what happened to him. Most people just never realized they were listening to a confession. Because that's the secret buried beneath more than a century of fairy dust and fantasy. Peter Pan was never about the wonder of childhood. It was about the terror of losing it. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is that Barrie spent his life trying to build a place where nobody had to grow up, only to discover that nobody can stay in Neverland forever. The cost of Neverland. For more than a century, Peter Pan has been marketed as one of the greatest celebrations of childhood ever written. A story about adventure, wonder, imagination. A magical world where children can fly, fight pirates, and escape the responsibilities of growing up. And maybe that's why the truth underneath it feels so unsettling. Because the deeper we dug into the history, the less Peter Pan looked like a fairy tale. And the more it looked like a warning. A warning about grief, a warning about obsession, a warning about what happens when someone becomes trapped inside the past. The real tragedy isn't that J.M. Barrie loved childhood. Most people do. The real tragedy is that Barrie appears to have believed childhood was the only safe place left. Everything beyond it carried danger. Adulthood meant loss, change, distance, mortality, heartbreak. And so he built Neverland, a place where none of those things could enter. At least in theory. But there is a problem with trying to stop time. Life depends on movement. Children are supposed to grow. People are supposed to change. Relationships are supposed to evolve. Memory is supposed to hurt sometimes. Loss is supposed to teach us something. Without those things, we don't remain innocent. We remain unfinished. And that's what makes Peter Pan so fascinating. The story accidentally reveals the very thing it tries to escape. Because Peter never grows older. But he never grows wiser either. He never heals. He never matures. He never forms lasting connections. He never truly lives. He simply repeats, forever, the same adventures, the same mistakes, the same emotional emptiness again and again and again. And maybe that's the real horror hiding underneath Neverland. Not death, not pirates, not monsters, stagnation, the idea of becoming trapped inside one version of yourself forever. Unable to move forward. Unable to become anything new. Unable to let go. That is not freedom. That is a prison. And when you look back at the lives of the real Lost Boys, the symbolism becomes almost heartbreaking. George never reached adulthood. Michael never escaped the shadows following him. Peter spent decades trying to outrun a fictional identity that consumed him. Jack buried the story in silence. Nicholas spent his life defending it. Each of them carried Neverland in different ways. Each of them paid a price. Not because of magic, not because of a curse, but because stories have consequences, especially when they are built from unresolved pain. The greatest stories endure because they contain truth. And Peter Pan contains a truth so uncomfortable that people often miss it entirely. The boy who never grew up was never the hero. He was the symptom, the visible expression of a wound that never healed. A child frozen in time because someone loved him too much to let him go. A fantasy created by a man trying to outrun grief. And a cultural icon that continues to resonate because every human being understands, at least a little, the fear of growing older, the fear of change, the fear of loss. But eventually, we all face the same choice. We can spend our lives chasing Neverland, or we can step through the window and accept reality. One path offers nostalgia. The other offers life. And despite everything Peter Pan teaches, only one of those paths allows us to truly grow. Because childhood was never meant to last forever. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the beauty of childhood comes from the fact that it ends. Maybe the reason we treasure those memories is because we know we cannot stay there. Maybe growing up isn't the tragedy. Maybe refusing to grow up is. And that may be the darkest secret hidden inside Peter Pan. For over 100 years, Peter Pan has been sold to the world as a story about magic. A story about flying. A story about pirates, fairy dust, adventure, and the dream of staying young forever. But now you've seen the story underneath the story. The version hidden behind the stage lights. The version buried beneath decades of animation, merchandise, theme parks, and bedtime stories. The version that begins with a little boy watching his family collapse after the death of his brother. The version that follows a grieving mother who found comfort in the idea that her favorite child would never grow old. The version that transformed trauma into mythology. And perhaps that's why Peter Pan has survived for so long. Not because it's simple. Because it isn't. Not because it's comforting. Because much of it isn't. But because underneath the fantasy, Peter Pan touches something deeply human. The fear of losing what we love. The fear of growing older. The fear of change. The fear that time moves too quickly and takes too much from us along the way. J.M. Barrie spent his entire life wrestling with those fears. And through Peter Pan, he gave them a face. A smiling face. A flying face. A face that made the darkness easier to look at. But the darkness was always there. Waiting beneath the surface. Waiting behind the second star to the right. Waiting inside Neverland itself. Because Neverland was never truly about adventure. It was about escape. Escape from grief. Escape from responsibility. Escape from adulthood. Escape from reality. And in the end, that may be why Peter Pan remains so fascinating. Not because he can fly, but because he cannot move forward. He is trapped. Frozen. A permanent child wandering endlessly through a dream he can never leave. A ghost disguised as a boy. A confession disguised as a fairy tale. And a warning disguised as a wish. So the next time someone tells you Peter Pan is simply a story about childhood wonder, remember the real story. Remember David Barrie. Remember the Davies boys. Remember the grief. Remember the tragedy. Remember the cost of Neverland. Because once you know the history, you never see the fairy tale the same way again. And maybe that's exactly how it was always meant to be. Good night, Neverland. And thank you for flying with us. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more deep dives into the dark histories, forgotten truths, literary mysteries, historical conspiracies, mob legends, haunted places, and the stories hidden underneath the stories, make sure you subscribe to the channel and join us here in the Pizzaverse. Because around here, we don't just repeat history. We investigate it. We question it. We pull apart the myths and look at what's hiding underneath. And trust me, there are still a lot of fairy tales with skeletons in the closet. If there's a topic you'd like us to investigate next, let us know in the comments below. And until next time, keep asking questions. Because sometimes the truth is far stranger than the story. Thank you for watching another Pizzaverse Studios documentary. We genuinely appreciate every view, every comment, every like, every share, and every one of you who spends your time going down these strange rabbit holes with us. Because, let's be honest, there are approximately 9,000 channels on the internet telling you Peter Pan is a wholesome story about positive thinking and happy little adventures. And then there's us. The people who looked at a century-old children's classic and collectively said, "Hold on a second, what the hell is going on here?" So thank you for joining us on this deeply uncomfortable journey into grief, psychology, Victorian trauma, literary symbolism, drowning nightmares, mysterious wills, emotionally damaged playwrights, and flying children that somehow became existential horror. That's a very specific audience, and we're glad you're part of it. Now go get some sleep. Maybe drink some water. Touch some grass. Call your therapist. And if a boy wearing green tights shows up outside your bedroom window tonight, offering eternal youth and a free trip to Neverland, for the love of God, check his references first. We'll see you in the next documentary. Until then, this is Pizzaverse Studios. And remember, not every fairy tale wants to be saved.